Captain Lisa Rodriguez clutched her stomach as she stumbled out of the base medical clinic, her face pale and her flight suit damp with perspiration. The base doctor had been clear severe food poisoning, no flying for at least 48 hours, possibly longer. The irony was brutal. After 3 months of grounding due to her previous hard landing incident, she'd finally been cleared to return to flight status yesterday. Now this, the mission she was supposed to fly in 2 hours, wasn't routine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. A joint NATO exercise involving the extraction of a high-value target from hostile territory, with delegations from 12 countries observing. Her replacement pilot was Captain Williams, but he was currently en route from Stuttgart and wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. The exercise coordinator, a by-the-book colonel named Harrison, had made it clear that postponing the demonstration would be seen as American incompetence by their NATO allies. Outside the medical clinic, Greta watched Rodriguez lean against a lamppost, clearly struggling with nausea. 6 months of observation had taught her to read the subtle signs of pilot distress, and Rodriguez's body language screamed, grounded. Greta's military instincts, honed by years of combat operations, immediately began calculating the implications. She'd been listening to radio chatter through a small scanner she kept hidden in her jacket, a habit from her combat days that provided both entertainment and intelligence. The NATO exercise involved a simulated rescue mission in mountainous terrain, requiring precision flying that would challenge even experienced pilots. The observers included a British general she recognized from news reports, a French colonel, whose reputation preceded him, and several officials from Eastern European countries, still proving their worthiness to NATO leadership. What the pilots planning this mission didn't realize was that Greta had flown virtually identical operations during the Balkan conflicts. The terrain around Ramstein was remarkably similar to the mountains of Bosnia, where she'd conducted night extractions under fire, often in weather conditions that would ground most military aviators. She'd developed techniques for flying in zero visibility, for landing in impossible terrain, for maintaining aircraft control under circumstances that would challenge the laws of physics. Her discharge papers, which she read obsessively during the long nights in homeless shelters, contained mission reports that read like fiction. Emergency landings with complete hydraulic failure. Extractions conducted while under direct fire from surface-to-air missiles. A particularly memorable mission where she'd landed a damaged helicopter upside down intentionally to avoid enemy detection while evacuating wounded soldiers. The upside-down landing had become legendary among Croatian pilots, though the technique had never been officially documented or taught. It required an understanding of rotor dynamics that went beyond textbook knowledge, an intuitive feel for how aircraft behaved when every conventional rule was deliberately broken. Greta had developed the maneuver out of desperation, but it had saved 12 lives and earned her a commendation from NATO Command. As she watched the morning's activity through the fence, Greta's experienced eye caught details that escaped the attention of ground crews and pilots alike. The Black Hawk scheduled for the NATO exercise had a subtle vibration in its tail rotor, barely visible, but consistent with a bearing that was beginning to fail. The pilots wouldn't notice it during normal flight operations, but under the stress of aggressive maneuvering, it could prove catastrophic. She'd seen that exact failure mode twice during combat operations in the Balkans. Both times, pilots who didn't recognize the early warning signs had lost aircraft and crew. The fix was simple if you knew what to look for, but the symptoms were subtle enough that most mechanics would miss them during routine inspections. Greta pulled out a small notebook, actually a combat diary she'd kept throughout her military service, and began sketching the Black Hawk's configuration. Her drawings were precise, almost architectural in their detail, annotated with notes about weight distribution, center of gravity calculations, and performance parameters that she'd memorized through years of flying similar aircraft under extreme conditions. The irony was overwhelming. Here she sat, invisible and dismissed, watching pilots prepare for a mission that was essentially identical to operations she'd conducted dozens of times. They had the training, the support, the official recognition, everything she'd lost. But they lacked her experience with the specific combination of factors that made this type of mission particularly dangerous. As Rodriguez finally managed to walk back toward the medical clinic, clearly unable to fly, Greta felt the familiar tension that preceded combat operations. Something was about to go wrong. Her instincts, developed through years of survival in hostile airspace, were screaming warnings that nobody else was hearing. She didn't know that in less than an hour, her invisible expertise would become the difference between a successful NATO demonstration and an international incident that could reshape military alliances. Sometimes the most important person in an operation was the one nobody noticed. The Black Hawk waited on the tarmac, unaware that its scheduled pilot was incapacitated and its most qualified backup was sitting outside the fence with a cardboard sign. Greta's fingers traced the edges of her discharge papers through the waterproof pouch hidden inside her jacket, a ritual she performed whenever memories of her former life threatened to overwhelm her present reality. The papers told a sanitized version of her downfall, but they couldn't capture the weight of what she'd lost or the series of betrayals that had brought Croatia's most celebrated female pilot to a fence outside a German air base. Major Alexander Petrov had been her commanding officer, and for 6 months, her mentor. When she'd reported his assault to the chain of command, Greta had believed the system would protect her. She'd been naive enough to think that her combat record, 12 successful extractions under fire, 3 aircraft saves that should have been fatal, crashes, 1 mission that had prevented an international incident, would shield her from retaliation. Instead, Petrov's connections within the Croatian Defense Ministry had orchestrated a character assassination more thorough than any enemy fire she'd faced in combat. Her maintenance logs were questioned, her mission reports scrutinized for inconsistencies, her psychological evaluation subjected to interpretations that painted her as unstable. The same aggressive flying that had earned her commendations was suddenly characterized as reckless endangerment. The final blow had come during a routine fitness evaluation. Petrov had arranged for her to be tested by a doctor who was his cousin, a detail that emerged only after her discharge. The PTSD diagnosis that followed wasn't entirely fabricated. The stress of fighting both enemies in the air and superiors on the ground had taken its toll. But the severity was exaggerated, the prognosis deliberately pessimistic, the recommendations carefully crafted to end her career. Her father, a mechanic who had taught her to love aircraft before she could properly walk, had died while she was fighting the charges. Her mother, ashamed of the scandal and pressure from neighbors who believed the whispered allegations against her daughter's character, had asked Greta not to attend the funeral. The small apartment in Zagreb had been sold to pay legal fees that ultimately proved useless. The NATO commanders, who had personally thanked her for missions that remained classified, couldn't publicly support her without revealing operations that were still sensitive. Their private assurances meant nothing when her own country's military was systematically destroying her reputation. The alliance she had served with distinction became an observer to her professional execution. 6 months ago, Greta had arrived at Ramstein with nothing but her discharge papers, a small bag of belongings, and an unshakable need to be near military aircraft. She'd chosen this base specifically because it housed the same UH-60 Black Hawk she'd flown during joint NATO exercises aircraft. She understood better than most certified pilots the other homeless veterans who occasionally shared her corner knew fragments of her story. Tommy, a former Marine with half his left arm missing, understood the feeling of being discarded by the system he'd served. Maria, whose husband had died in Afghanistan, recognized the particular kind of grief that came from losing both love and purpose simultaneously. But none of them grasped the technical expertise that Greta carried like a hidden weapon. Her combat diary, filled with sketches and notes from over 100 missions, had become her most precious possession. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Page after page of aircraft configurations, weather conditions, tactical solutions to problems that existed only in the gray areas between official doctrine and battlefield reality. The upside-down landing technique was documented on page 347, accompanied by diagrams that showed rotor disc angles and power settings that defied conventional wisdom. What haunted her most wasn't the loss of status or income, but the silence of the aircraft. For 15 years, the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades had been the soundtrack to her life. The vibration of a helicopter's controls had been as familiar as her own heartbeat. Now she could only listen to others fly, watching through chain link as pilots practiced maneuvers she could execute in her sleep. The irony was that Ramstein's pilots were good, some were exceptional, but they were flying by the book in ways that would get them killed in actual combat. She'd seen it before. The difference between peacetime pilots and those who'd learned to fly in places where textbook solutions could prove fatal. The NATO exercise scheduled for this afternoon was designed to bridge that gap, but the observers wouldn't understand what they were really watching. As Greta adjusted her position against the fence, she caught sight of her reflection in the base's polished welcome sign. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the decorated pilot whose photograph had once hung in the Croatian Air Force Academy. But beneath the matted hair and oversized clothing, the eyes remained sharp, calculating, professionally lethal. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, those eyes would spot something that would save lives and restore her identity. Sometimes redemption arrived disguised as catastrophe. At 13:47 hours, Greta noticed the pattern that would change everything. She'd been tracking aircraft movements with the unconscious precision of someone whose survival had once depended on situational awareness, when something in the NATO delegation's behavior caught her attention. The British General Morrison, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his impatience with incompetence, was checking his watch every 30 seconds and speaking in increasingly sharp tones to his aide. Through her small radio scanner, Greta caught fragments of encrypted communications that painted a disturbing picture. The high-value target for today's extraction exercise wasn't simulated, it was real. A NATO intelligence asset embedded deep in a Russian criminal organization had been compromised and needed immediate extraction from a location just inside the Czech border. The exercise was cover for an actual rescue mission that had to succeed, without appearing to be anything more than routine training. The political implications were staggering. If Russia discovered that NATO was conducting active intelligence operations in their sphere of influence, it could trigger a diplomatic crisis that might shatter the alliance. If the extraction failed and the asset was captured, the intelligence compromised would endanger operations across Eastern Europe. The mission had to appear routine while being executed with surgical precision under the observation of military officials from 12 countries. What made Greta's blood freeze was the aircraft assignment. The Black Hawk she'd been watching, the one with the developing tail rotor bearing failure, was scheduled to conduct the extraction. Captain Rodriguez's food poisoning hadn't just grounded a pilot. It had assigned a critical mission to aircraft that could fail catastrophically under the stress of aggressive maneuvering required for a hot extraction. She pulled out her combat diary and quickly referenced her notes from page 247, where she documented an identical bearing failure during a mission in Bosnia. The symptoms were unmistakable, a vibration frequency of approximately 1.2 Hz visible in the tail rotor assembly, most apparent during ground operations, when rotor wash patterns showed subtle asymmetries. Under normal flight conditions, the bearing would hold. Under combat stress, rapid acceleration, aggressive turns, emergency power settings, it would fail within 20 minutes of sustained operations. The failure mode was particularly dangerous because it occurred gradually, then suddenly. Pilots would experience increasing difficulty with yaw control, compensating instinctively until the bearing ceased completely. At that point, the aircraft would become uncontrollable within seconds, usually resulting in an autorotational emergency. Landing that was survivable if you were over friendly territory and fatal if you were being pursued by hostile forces. Greta's scanner crackled with an update that confirmed her worst fears. The backup pilot, Captain Williams, was still 3 hours away from Ramstein. The exercise coordinators were discussing the possibility of postponing the mission, but General Morrison's voice cut through the debate with military finality. The extraction occurs as scheduled. Find me a pilot. She watched through the fence as ground crews conducted final preparations on the Black Hawk, their routine inspection missing the subtle signs that were obvious to someone who'd learned to read aircraft condition through survival necessity. The crew chief, a competent sergeant with 15 years of experience, performed his checklist with professional thoroughness, but lacked the combat experience to recognize warnings that weren't in the manual. The irony was overwhelming. 50 yards away, NATO's most senior officers were about to launch a critical mission in aircraft that could kill everyone aboard, while the one person who could identify and potentially solve the problem sat outside the fence with a cardboard sign. Greta's mind raced through possibilities, all of them requiring her to reveal herself to people who would see only a homeless woman making outrageous claims about military hardware. But as she watched the delegation move toward the flight line for their pre-mission briefing, Greta realized that staying silent would mean watching people die. The asset waiting for extraction was someone's father, husband, son, a human being whose life depended on aircraft performing beyond their design limits. The pilots preparing for the mission were professionals doing their jobs, unaware that their aircraft was a ticking time bomb disguised as a routine maintenance issue. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting after hours of sitting against the fence. Her discharge papers felt heavy in her jacket as she approached the security checkpoint, knowing that the next few minutes would either restore her identity or confirm her complete invisibility to the military system she'd once served with distinction. The security guard, a young airman who'd seen her every day for 6 months without really noticing her, looked up from his newspaper with mild annoyance. Behind him, she could see the NATO delegation boarding vehicles that would take them to the flight line while ground crews made final preparations for a mission that could determine the future of intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. Greta took a deep breath and spoke the words that would either save lives or confirm her irrelevance. I need to speak to the mission commander. The Black Hawk has a bearing failure that will kill everyone aboard. The airman stared at her as if she'd spoken in ancient Greek while 50 yards away. An aircraft carrying a fatal mechanical defect prepared for the most important mission of the day. Sometimes the most crucial intelligence came from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes salvation wore the disguise of madness. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat like a sleeping predator on the tarmac of Ramstein Air Base, its rotor blades cutting sharp shadows across the concrete in the afternoon sun. 40 feet away, hunched against the security fence with a cardboard sign reading "Veteran Anything Helps," sat Greta Kozlov, black hair matted, clothes 3 sizes too big, invisible to the stream of officers walking past. They had no idea that the homeless woman they stepped around each morning could land that $21 million aircraft upside down in a thunderstorm. By sunset, every general in the Pentagon would know her name. Colonel James Mitchell adjusted his dress blues as he strode through the main entrance of Ramstein Air Base, Germany's largest American military installation. The morning briefing had been particularly intense. Russian activity near the Baltic, increased Chinese naval movements, and 3 separate terrorist threats across Europe. The weight of coordinating NATO's rapid response capabilities sat heavy on his shoulders as he passed through the security checkpoint. He barely glanced at the figure sitting against the perimeter fence. Just another homeless veteran that base security tolerated as long as she didn't cause trouble. Greta Kozlov had been there for 6 months, arriving each morning at 0700 hours and leaving each evening at 1800 hours with military precision that none of the passing officers noticed. Her cardboard sign was weathered and faded, but her posture, despite the oversized Army surplus jacket and worn boots, remained strangely erect. What Colonel Mitchell and every other officer didn't know was that Greta had been studying them. Not panhandling, but conducting reconnaissance with the focused intensity of someone trained in advanced surveillance techniques. She knew that Colonel Mitchell flew Chinook helicopters before his promotion to desk duty. She knew that Major Sarah Chun in the crisp flight suit had logged over 2,000 hours in Apache attack helicopters. She knew that Captain Rodriguez, who always bought her coffee on Fridays, was grounded pending investigation of a hard landing that had damaged a $30 million Black Hawk. Greta's position wasn't random. From her spot against the fence, she had a perfect view of the flight line where pilots practiced emergency procedures, where mechanics troubleshot complex avionics systems, and where the most advanced rotorcraft in the American military inventory sat between missions. For 6 months, she had been absorbing information that would have taken most pilots years to accumulate. The other homeless veterans who occasionally shared her corner knew her as the quiet one who used to fly. They didn't know she'd been the first female pilot in the Croatian Air Force, or that she'd flown over 100 combat missions during the Balkan conflicts. They certainly didn't know that her discharge papers, carefully protected in a waterproof bag hidden in her jacket, bore the signatures of NATO commanders who had personally commended her for actions that remained classified 20 years later. What had brought Croatia's most decorated female pilot to a fence outside a German air base was a story of bureaucratic betrayal that had cost her everything. A sexual assault allegation against a superior officer that she'd reported had been buried, her credibility destroyed. Her military career ended with a discharge that technically wasn't dishonorable, but made her unemployable in aviation. PTSD that followed had cost her the small apartment in Zagreb, then her savings, then her hope. But Greta Kozlov had never lost her eye for aircraft. As she watched the morning flight operations through the chain-link fence, her mind automatically calculated wind speeds, approach angles, and power settings with the precision of someone whose survival had once depended on split-second aviation decisions. She noticed things the base's own pilots missed: subtle mechanical issues, inefficient flight patterns, dangerous habits that could prove fatal under combat conditions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now sat outside the fence of the very alliance she had once served with distinction. NATO had used her skills when they needed her, honored her when it was convenient, and discarded her when supporting her became politically complicated. Yet here she was, drawn to military aviation like iron filings to a magnet, unable to stay away from the machines that had once been extensions of her own body. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows from the helicopter she longed to fly, Greta adjusted her cardboard sign and settled in for another day of invisible observation. She had no idea that by evening, her anonymity would be shattered forever. Her skills would be tested beyond anything she'd faced in combat, and her presence at this fence would prove to be the difference between a successful mission and an international catastrophe. The Black Hawk helicopter that would soon make her famous sat 30 yards away, its systems check complete, waiting for a pilot who was about to call in sick with food poisoning. Sometimes, fate wore the disguise of coincidence. Airman First Class Bradley Cooper looked up from his sports section with the weary expression of someone who dealt with every variety of crazy that gravitated toward military installations. In his 18 months at Ramstein's main gate, he'd Encountered conspiracy theorists convinced the base housed aliens, former soldiers demanding recognition for classified missions that never existed, and homeless individuals whose mental illness manifested as elaborate military fantasies. "Ma'am, you need to step back from the checkpoint," Cooper said automatically, his hand moving toward his radio. "If you're experiencing a medical emergency, I can call the base hospital." Greta fought to keep her voice steady, knowing that her next words would determine whether she saved lives or confirmed her invisibility. "Airman, I'm a former NATO pilot with 15 years of combat experience. The UH-60 Black Hawk on Pad 7 has a tail rotor bearing failure that will kill everyone aboard if it's used for high-stress operations. I need to speak to the mission commander immediately." Cooper's expression shifted from annoyance to practiced patience. He'd heard variations of this story dozens of times, homeless veterans claiming expertise they'd never possessed, desperate for attention or validation or simply a warm meal and someone to listen. The woman standing before him looked like she hadn't showered in weeks. Her clothes were clearly surplus store rejects, and her claims were exactly the kind of grandiose delusion that accompanied certain types of mental breakdown. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but aircraft maintenance is handled by certified technicians with years of training. If there was a mechanical issue, our crew chiefs would have identified it during the standard inspection process." Through the fence, Greta could see the NATO delegation boarding a bus that would take them to the observation area. General Morrison was checking his watch again, his body language radiating the impatience of a man whose mission window was closing rapidly. The Black Hawk's rotors were beginning to turn as the replacement pilot, a young captain she didn't recognize, completed his pre-flight checklist. "Airman, please listen to me," Greta said, pulling out her discharge papers with hands that trembled from urgency, not fear. "These documents show I flew over 100 combat missions in UH-60 aircraft. I know what bearing failure looks like because I've seen it kill people. The vibration pattern in that aircraft's tail rotor assembly indicates a bearing that's approximately 6 hours from catastrophic failure under normal operations, 20 minutes under combat stress." Cooper glanced at the papers she thrust through the fence, but his training had taught him to be suspicious of documents that could be easily forged. Even if they were legitimate, discharge papers from a foreign military didn't give someone access to American air operations. His job was to maintain security, not to evaluate the mechanical expertise of homeless individuals making extraordinary claims. "Ma'am, even if you are who you say you are, I can't interrupt mission operations based on concerns from unauthorized personnel. Our pilots and mechanics are the best in the world. They don't need assistance from civilians." The dismissal hit Greta like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because she could see the mission launching while she stood powerless to prevent a tragedy she could foresee with professional certainty. The replacement pilot was a competent aviator flying by the book, but he lacked the combat experience to recognize warnings that weren't in the manual. The crew chief was thorough and dedicated, but peacetime maintenance schedules couldn't account for stress factors that only emerged under combat conditions. Her radio scanner crackled with mission communications as the extraction team received final coordinates. The asset was located in mountainous terrain that would require aggressive maneuvering, exactly the kind of flying that would push the failing bearing beyond its tolerance limits. Greta could visualize the mission profile from the radio chatter. Low-level approach through valleys to avoid radar detection, rapid deceleration for landing, emergency power settings for extraction under potential hostile fire. "Airman, that aircraft will experience tail rotor failure approximately 18 minutes into the mission," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd seen identical scenarios play out with fatal results. "The crew will have maybe 30 seconds to auto-rotate before losing all directional control. If they're over friendly territory and the pilot is exceptional, they might survive. If they're in hostile airspace or mountainous terrain, everyone dies." Cooper keyed his radio, but not to relay her warning. Gate security to watch commander, requesting assistance with a disturbance at checkpoint 1. Individual making claims about aircraft safety. Appears to be experiencing a mental health episode. As she watched the Black Hawk lift off its rotor, wash scattering debris across the tarmac, Greta realized that her warnings were being interpreted as the ravings of someone whose grip on reality had been broken by trauma and homelessness. The system she'd once served with distinction now saw her as a threat to be managed rather than an expert to be consulted. The irony was brutal. Her professional knowledge had never been more valuable, but her social status made it impossible to share. Sometimes the most important voice in any crisis belonged to someone nobody wanted to hear. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams approached the checkpoint with the measured stride of someone accustomed to managing complicated situations. 22 years in the Air Force had taught her to distinguish between genuine security threats and individuals whose problems required medical rather than military intervention. The homeless woman at the gate fell clearly into the latter category, disheveled, agitated, making grandiose claims about aircraft systems while waving what appeared to be foreign military documents. "Cooper, what's the situation?" Williams asked, automatically positioning herself between the fence and the growing commotion that was beginning to attract attention from passing personnel. "Sergeant, this individual claims to be a former NATO pilot. She's insisting that the Black Hawk conducting today's exercise has some kind of mechanical failure that will cause a crash. Says she needs to speak to the mission commander immediately." Williams studied Greta through the fence, noting details that Cooper had missed. The woman's posture remained military despite her circumstances, shoulders back, weight evenly distributed. Hands positioned for quick movement rather than passive pleading. Her eyes were clear and focused, not the unfocused stare that typically accompanied the mental health episodes Williams encountered at base entrances. "Ma'am, I'm Master Sergeant Williams. I understand you have concerns about aircraft safety. Can you explain specifically what you believe you've observed?" Greta felt a flicker of hope at being addressed as a person rather than a problem to be managed. Williams was asking the right questions, approaching the situation with professional skepticism rather than automatic dismissal. But time was running out. Her radio scanner indicated that the Black Hawk was already 5 minutes into a mission that would turn fatal in approximately 13 minutes. "Sergeant, the UH-60 that just launched has a tail rotor bearing that's operating outside normal parameters. The failure signature is visible in the rotor wash pattern during ground operations, a subtle asymmetry that indicates bearing wear approximately 6 hours from complete failure under normal conditions. The mission profile I'm monitoring on emergency frequencies indicates low-level operations in mountainous terrain, under potential hostile contact. Those stress factors will accelerate the failure timeline to approximately 20 minutes from launch." Williams found herself impressed despite her skepticism. The woman wasn't making vague claims about seeing something wrong. She was providing specific, technical analysis using terminology that suggested real expertise. But allowing unauthorized personnel to influence mission operations based on mechanical theories would be a career-ending breach of protocol. "Ma'am, even if your assessment is accurate, I don't have authority to recall a mission in progress based on concerns from someone outside the chain of command. Our aircraft undergo rigorous maintenance inspections by certified technicians. If there was a mechanical issue, it would have been identified during standard procedures." Greta pulled out her combat diary, flipping to page 247 where she documented an identical bearing failure during an extraction mission in Bosnia. The sketches were precise, almost architectural in their detail, showing rotor disc angles and failure progressions that had been burned into her memory by watching 2 crew members die when their aircraft became uncontrollable during a hot extraction. "Sergeant, this is the same failure mode that killed Staff Sergeant Morrison and flight engineer Shown during a NATO operation in 1999. The bearing failure occurs gradually, then catastrophically. Pilots compensate for increasing yaw control difficulty until the bearing seizes completely, at which point the aircraft becomes uncontrollable within 15 to 20 seconds. I documented the warning signs because NATO maintenance protocols didn't account for stress factors that only emerge under combat conditions. Williams examined the diary pages, noting the professional quality of the technical drawings and the detailed annotations that suggested extensive hands-on experience with aircraft systems. The documentation was either the work of someone with genuine expertise or an elaborate fabrication created by someone with access to classified maintenance information. Either possibility raised questions that made her uncomfortable. Her radio crackled with an update from Mission Control. Nighthawk 27, you are 5 minutes from target area. Be advised, local weather is deteriorating. Wind gusts up to 40 knots in the extraction zone. Greta's face went pale as she processed the implications. High wind conditions would require the pilot to use more aggressive control inputs to maintain stability during the extraction. Exactly the kind of stress that would push the failing bearing beyond its tolerance limits. The mission that was already dangerous was about to become a guaranteed catastrophe. Sergeant, those wind conditions will kill everyone aboard that aircraft, Greta said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd seen this scenario play out before. The pilot will compensate for wind gusts by increasing yaw control inputs, which will accelerate bearing failure. They have maybe 8 minutes before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. Williams faced an impossible decision. Protocol demanded that she treat Greta as an unauthorized individual making unsubstantiated claims about military operations. But her 22 years of experience told her that the woman standing before her possessed knowledge that could save lives. Following regulations might mean watching people die. Breaking protocol might mean ending her own career while being wrong about a situation she wasn't qualified to evaluate. The Black Hawk carrying the extraction team was now 7 minutes into a mission that might have 13 minutes left before mechanical failure turned it into a tomb. Sometimes the most dangerous choice was the one that felt safest. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through Williams' radio with the clipped urgency of someone whose mission was beginning to deviate from plan. All stations, be advised that Nighthawk 27 is reporting slight vibration in the tail rotor. Assembly, pilot indicates it's within normal parameters, but requests confirmation that backup aircraft is standing by. Greta's blood turned to ice water. The bearing failure was beginning exactly as she'd predicted, following the same progression she'd documented in Bosnia. The pilot was experiencing the early stages of yaw control degradation, a subtle vibration that seemed manageable but would escalate rapidly under continued stress. She had maybe 6 minutes before the bearing seized completely. Sergeant Williams, Greta said, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with professional urgency. That vibration is the beginning of catastrophic failure. The pilot is reporting exactly what Staff Sergeant Morrison reported 3 minutes before his aircraft became uncontrollable. You need to recall that mission immediately. Williams found herself caught between regulations that demanded she dismiss unauthorized input and instincts developed through 2 decades of military service. The homeless woman's prediction was proving accurate in real time, which meant either she possessed genuine expertise or she was making educated guesses based on overheard radio communications. Either way, people were about to die if the mission continued. Her radio crackled again. Mission Control, Nighthawk 27 requests emergency landing clearance at nearest available facility. Vibration is increasing and pilot is experiencing difficulty maintaining heading control. The NATO delegation in the observation area was beginning to show signs of concern. General Morrison, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his intolerance for operational failures, was speaking in sharp tones to his aide while pointing toward the mission display screens. The other foreign observers were exchanging glances that suggested growing awareness that the demonstration was becoming something else entirely. Colonel Harrison's response came through with the authority of someone whose career depended on mission success. Negative, Nighthawk 2-7. Emergency landing facilities are not available in your current location. Continue to target area and execute extraction as planned. Medical team will be standing by upon your return. Greta felt the familiar surge of combat, adrenaline that preceded moments when split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Harrison was making the classic mistake of peacetime. Commanders prioritizing mission completion over crew survival because he'd never seen what happened when aircraft systems failed catastrophically under combat stress. Sergeant Colonel Harrison just killed everyone aboard that aircraft, she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd seen this scenario play out before. The pilot requested emergency landing because he's losing directional control. Continuing the mission will push the bearing beyond its failure point. They have maybe 4 minutes before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. Through the fence, she could see the NATO delegation being briefed by junior officers, whose body language suggested they were delivering information that no one wanted to hear. The exercise that was supposed to demonstrate American military competence was turning into a potential international incident that could damage alliance relationships for years. Williams made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. She keyed her radio to the emergency frequency and spoke words that violated every protocol in the book. Mission Control. This is Master Sergeant Williams at Main Gate Security. I have credible intelligence indicating that Nighthawk 2-7 is experiencing mechanical failure that will result in aircraft loss if the mission continues. Recommend immediate abort and emergency landing at nearest facility. The response was immediate and explosive. Gate security, you are not authorized to monitor mission frequencies or provide tactical input. Clear this channel immediately and report to your commanding officer for disciplinary action. But Williams' transmission had accomplished something unexpected. Master Chief Petty Officer Sandra Martinez, the Navy's senior aviation maintenance specialist observing the exercise, had overheard the radio traffic and was now speaking urgently to General Morrison. Martinez had 30 years of helicopter maintenance experience and understood the implications of tail rotor vibration reports from pilots who'd never complained about mechanical issues before. Greta watched through the fence as the delegation's attention shifted from polite observation to urgent consultation. Her radio scanner indicated that Nighthawk 2-7 was now 3 minutes from the target area, with tail rotor vibration increasing to levels that would soon make the aircraft unflyable. The mission was entering its final phase. Either the extraction would succeed despite failing aircraft systems, or 8 people would die because protocol prevented acknowledging expertise from unexpected sources. Sometimes salvation required someone to break all the rules. Master Chief Martinez approached the observation area with the purposeful stride of someone whose expertise had been earned through 3 decades of keeping aircraft airborne under impossible conditions. She'd overheard Master Sergeant Williams' unauthorized radio transmission and recognized the specific language patterns that distinguished genuine technical knowledge from educated guessing. Someone at the main gate was providing analysis that matched her own growing concerns about Nighthawk 2-7's mechanical status. General Morrison, Martinez said, interrupting a heated discussion between NATO observers about whether to abort the mission. I need to speak with whoever provided that tail rotor analysis. The symptoms being reported match a bearing failure mode that's killed aircrew before. We should consider emergency abort procedures. Morrison's pale blue eyes fixed on Martinez, with the intensity of someone whose tactical brilliance had been forged in combat zones where hesitation killed people. He'd built his reputation on making correct decisions with incomplete information, and his instincts were telling him that the exercise was becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "Chief, are you telling me we have a mechanical failure that our maintenance teams missed during standard inspection procedures?" Through her radio scanner, Greta monitored the increasingly urgent communications between Nighthawk 27 and Mission Control. The pilot's voice carried the controlled tension of someone fighting aircraft systems that were degrading in real time. "Mission Control, vibration has increased significantly, requiring constant left rudder input to maintain heading. Strongly recommend abort to nearest landing facility." Colonel Harrison's response came back with bureaucratic inflexibility that made Greta's combat-trained instincts scream warnings. "Nighthawk 27, you are 90 seconds from target area. Complete the extraction and return to base. Medical evaluation will determine if mechanical inspection is warranted upon landing." Greta realized that Harrison was making decisions based on political pressure rather than aircrew safety. The NATO observers represented countries whose continued support for American military leadership depended on demonstrations of competence and reliability. Aborting the mission would be seen as operational failure that could damage alliance relationships, while completing it successfully would reinforce American credibility. What Harrison didn't understand was that the bearing failure followed a predictable timeline that didn't care about political considerations. Greta opened her combat diary to page 247 and began calculating stress factors based on the mission profile. She was monitoring through radio intercepts. The target area was located in mountainous terrain that would require aggressive maneuvering. During the extraction, rapid deceleration for landing, emergency power settings for quick departure, constant control inputs to compensate for wind gusts and obstacle clearance. Each of these factors would accelerate bearing wear beyond the failure point she'd identified during her fence line observation. Master Chief Martinez was now examining technical diagrams with General Morrison, pointing to rotor assembly schematics, while explaining failure modes that weren't covered in standard maintenance protocols. Greta could see through the fence that Martinez understood the implications of tail rotor vibration reports from experienced pilots who'd never complained about mechanical issues before. "General," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose technical expertise had saved lives in multiple combat zones, "the symptoms being reported indicate bearing failure that will result in aircraft loss within minutes. I've seen this failure mode kill aircrew in Iraq and Afghanistan. We need to abort this mission immediately." But even as Martinez spoke, Greta's radio crackled with the transmission that confirmed her worst fears. "Mission Control, Nighthawk 27 is on final approach to target area. Beginning extraction sequence. Tail rotor vibration is severe but controllable. Will attempt rapid extraction and immediate departure." The pilot was committing to a course of action that would push the failing bearing beyond its tolerance limits. Landing in confined mountainous terrain required precise control inputs that would stress the tail rotor assembly exactly as Greta had predicted. She could visualize the sequence of events that would follow. Initial landing successful, but bearing degradation accelerated by power changes. Extraction completed, but aircraft systems failing during departure. Loss of directional control during takeoff phase when recovery options were limited. Through the fence, she watched General Morrison receive updates from his aide while NATO observers gathered around communication equipment. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase American military competence was becoming a real-time test of whether expertise could overcome bureaucratic inertia before people died. Greta's hand shook as she realized that her warnings had reached the right people but might be too late to prevent the tragedy she could foresee with professional certainty. The bearing failure was following exactly the progression she'd documented in Bosnia, but the chain of command was responding with peacetime procedures to a problem that required combat-tested solutions. Sometimes technical expertise wasn't enough. to overcome institutional momentum. Sometimes the most accurate prediction in the world couldn't prevent disasters that everyone saw coming, but no one had authority to stop. General Morrison strode toward the main gate with the purposeful intensity of someone whose career had been built on cutting through bureaucratic obstacles to reach tactical solutions. Master Chief Martinez had convinced him that the homeless woman's analysis warranted immediate investigation, but Colonel Harrison was blocking any deviation from the established mission protocol with the rigid determination of someone whose promotion depended on flawless execution of the NATO demonstration. "Colonel," Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded operations in 3 combat zones, "I'm ordering an immediate abort of the extraction mission. We have credible intelligence indicating imminent mechanical failure that will result in aircraft loss and crew fatalities." Harrison's response came through the command frequency with barely concealed frustration. "General, with all due respect, we cannot abort a NATO demonstration based on concerns from unauthorized personnel outside the fence. Our maintenance teams have certified that aircraft is airworthy. Completing this mission successfully is essential for maintaining alliance credibility." The conflict represented everything wrong with peacetime military decision-making that Greta had witnessed throughout her career. Harrison was prioritizing institutional reputation over aircrew survival, making choices based on political considerations rather than tactical reality. Morrison understood that dead pilots would damage NATO relationships far more than a canceled exercise, but the chain of command was structured to prevent field-grade officers from overruling mission parameters without compelling evidence. Through her radio scanner, Greta monitored the extraction team's communications as they landed in the target area. "Mission control. Nighthawk 27 is on the ground. Tail rotor vibration is severe, requiring constant compensation. Extraction team is moving to secure the asset. Request priority clearance for immediate departure once extraction is complete." The timeline was exactly as she'd predicted. The bearing was degrading rapidly under the stress of landing operations, but hadn't yet reached the catastrophic failure point. The crew had maybe 3 minutes to complete the extraction and begin takeoff procedures before the aircraft became uncontrollable. Every second of delay increased the probability that everyone aboard would die. Master Sergeant Williams approached the gate with bolt cutters she'd requisitioned from base maintenance, her face set with the determination of someone who decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations. 22 years of military service had taught her to recognize when protocol became an obstacle to mission success. "Ma'am," Williams said, cutting through the fence's security chains with practiced efficiency, "General Morrison wants to speak with you directly. Your analysis has been confirmed by our senior maintenance specialist. We need your expertise to guide the aircraft through emergency procedures." Greta felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror as she stepped through the opening Williams had created. Her warnings had been validated, but validation meant nothing if it came too late to prevent the tragedy she could foresee with professional certainty. The bearing failure was entering its final phase, following exactly the progression that had killed her colleagues in Bosnia. As they jogged toward the command area, Greta's radio crackled with the transmission that confirmed her worst fears. "Mission control. Extraction complete. Beginning takeoff procedures. Tail rotor vibration has increased significantly during ground operations. Aircraft is barely controllable." Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the communication with administrative inflexibility that made Greta want to scream. "Nighthawk 27, you are cleared for immediate departure. Fly direct to Ramstein for emergency landing and mechanical inspection. Medical teams are standing by." The orders were exactly wrong for the situation. Harrison was treating the bearing failure as a maintenance issue that could be managed through careful flying, when Greta knew from experience that the aircraft had minutes before becoming a death trap. Emergency procedures required immediate landing at the nearest suitable facility, not attempting to fly back to base with failing flight controls. "General Morrison," Greta said as they reached the command area, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose survival had depended on making correct decisions under impossible pressure. "That aircraft cannot make it back to Ramstein. The bearing failure will become catastrophic within minutes. They need to land immediately at any available facility, or everyone aboard will die." Morrison studied her with the intensity of someone whose tactical brilliance had been earned through combat operations where hesitation killed people. He'd built his reputation on making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information, and his instincts were telling him that the woman standing before him possessed knowledge that could save lives, but changing mission parameters required. Overruling a field-grade officer whose career depended on successful completion of the NATO demonstration. Sometimes saving lives required destroying careers. Sometimes the most important battles were fought against your own chain of command. Master Chief Martinez burst into the command area, carrying a tablet displaying real-time telemetry data that would change everything about the mission. Her face was pale with the realization that what they'd assumed was a simple mechanical failure was actually something far more sinister and immediately dangerous. "General Morrison," Martinez said, her voice tight with urgency, "we've been monitoring the wrong problem. The tail rotor bearing failure isn't random, it's deliberate sabotage. Someone modified the bearing assembly with a compound that accelerates wear under operational stress. This wasn't scheduled to fail during routine operations. It was designed to fail during the NATO demonstration." The revelation hit the command area like a physical blow. What they'd interpreted as mechanical failure was actually an act of sabotage timed to cause maximum political damage during the high-visibility international exercise. The failure wasn't following natural progression. It was following a deliberate timeline designed to kill NATO aircrew in front of foreign military observers. Greta felt the familiar ice-cold clarity that accompanied combat situations where survival depended on processing multiple threats simultaneously. Her analysis of the bearing failure had been correct, but incomplete. Someone with intimate knowledge of UH-60 systems had engineered the sabotage to exploit exactly the kind of stress factor she'd learned to recognize through combat experience. "General," she said, her mind racing through implications that made the tactical situation far more complex. "If this is sabotage, then standard emergency procedures won't work. The bearing wasn't modified to fail gradually, it was designed to fail catastrophically at a specific stress threshold. The aircraft might seem controllable until the exact moment it becomes unrecoverable." Through her radio scanner, urgent communications were revealing the scope of the crisis. "Mission control. Nighthawk 27 is experiencing complete loss of directional control. Aircraft is entering uncontrolled rotation. Beginning emergency auto-rotation procedures. Mayday, mayday, mayday." The sabotage had succeeded exactly as designed. The bearing had held through ground operations and initial takeoff, failing catastrophically. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude where recovery options were limited, 8 people were now falling toward mountainous terrain in an aircraft that had become uncontrollable, while NATO observers watched their demonstration turn into an international catastrophe. But Greta's combat experience had taught her something that peacetime pilots didn't understand. Aircraft that appeared unrecoverable could sometimes be saved through techniques that violated every rule in the manual. The upside-down landing she'd pioneered in Bosnia hadn't been designed for bearing failures, but the principle was applicable using unconventional control inputs to maintain directional stability when conventional methods failed. "General Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with professional authority, "I can talk them through a recovery technique, but it requires flying the aircraft in ways that no manual covers. The pilot will have to trust instructions. That seemed completely wrong according to his training." Morrison faced a decision that would define the rest of his career and potentially determine whether 8 people lived or died. Allowing a homeless woman with no official status to provide emergency flight guidance violated every protocol in military aviation, but conventional procedures had just proven inadequate for a sabotage scenario that no one had anticipated. NATO observers were now gathering around communication equipment, their diplomatic composure beginning to crack as they realized they were witnessing a potential disaster that could reshape alliance relationships. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase American military competence was becoming evidence of vulnerability to insider threats that intelligence agencies had warned about for years. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the command frequency with the desperation of someone whose career was disintegrating in real time. All available aircraft. Proceed to last known position of Nighthawk 27 for search and rescue operations. This is now a recovery mission with international implications. Through the chaos, Greta heard the transmission that would haunt her dreams if she failed to act. Mission control. This is Nighthawk 27. We have maybe 60 seconds before impact. Aircraft is completely uncontrollable using standard procedures. If anyone has suggestions for unconventional recovery techniques, we're out of options. General Morrison looked at Greta with the intensity of someone whose tactical brilliance had been earned through situations where impossible decisions determined who lived and who died. 8 people were falling towards certain death unless someone could provide guidance that transcended conventional training. "Ma'am," Morrison said, handing her the radio headset, "show me what a real pilot can do when regulations don't matter. And lives are the only thing that counts." Greta took the headset with hands that had stopped trembling, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with controlling aircraft under impossible conditions. Sometimes salvation required abandoning everything you'd been taught and trusting techniques that existed only in the gray areas between doctrine and desperation. The radio crackled with the voice of Captain Jake Stevens, Nighthawk 27's pilot, his words tight with controlled terror as he fought aircraft controls that had become actively hostile. "Mission control. Aircraft is in uncontrolled right rotation. Standard recovery procedures are ineffective. Rate of descent is increasing. Estimated impact in 45 seconds, unless we can regain directional control." Greta pressed the transmit button, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd guided aircraft through impossible situations before. "Nighthawk 27, this is an emergency flight advisor. I need you to listen carefully and trust instructions that will seem completely wrong according to your training. Your aircraft can be recovered, but only through techniques that aren't in any manual. Who is this?" Stevens' voice carried the skepticism of a pilot whose training had emphasized following established procedures, even under emergency conditions. "Mission control. I need guidance from certified flight instructors, not unauthorized personnel." "General." Morrison stepped forward and keyed the radio himself. "Captain Stevens, this is General Morrison. The person speaking to you has more combat helicopter experience than anyone currently available. Your aircraft has been sabotaged, and conventional recovery procedures will not work. Follow her instructions exactly if you want to live." The command area fell silent except for the static-filled transmissions from an aircraft that was falling toward mountainous terrain with 8 people aboard. NATO observers gathered around the communication equipment, their diplomatic composure replaced by the universal human reaction to watching people fight for survival in real time. Master Chief Martinez moved to Greta's side, opening technical manuals to pages that showed UH-60 control system schematics. "What do you need me to do?" Martinez asked, her 30 years of helicopter maintenance experience recognizing that conventional solutions had just proven inadequate. "Chief, I need you to talk me through the backup hydraulic systems while I guide him through an intentional inverted recovery," Greta said, her mind shifting into the combat problem-solving mode. that had kept her alive through over 100 dangerous missions. The sabotaged bearing has made normal yaw control impossible, but there's a technique that uses main rotor torque and collective pitch to control aircraft attitude when tail rotor authority is lost. Stephen's voice came through with increasing urgency. Emergency advisor, aircraft altitude is 800 feet and decreasing. Whatever you're planning, I need instructions now. Greta opened her combat diary to page 347, where sketches and calculations documented the upside-down landing technique she'd developed during the Balkan conflicts. The diagram showed rotor disc angles and power settings that defied conventional understanding of helicopter aerodynamics, but had proven effective when standard procedures would have resulted in aircraft loss. Captain Stevens, I need you to reduce collective pitch to minimum and simultaneously apply full left cyclic while maintaining current power setting. This will seem like you're making the rotation worse, but you're actually entering a controlled inverted maneuver that will allow you to regain directional authority using main rotor torque. Are you insane? Stephen's response carried the horror of a pilot being asked to deliberately make his emergency worse. Reducing collective will increase our rate of descent. We'll impact the ground before completing any recovery maneuver. Martinez looked over Greta's diagrams, her engineering mind processing the aerodynamic principles behind the seemingly impossible technique. Captain Stevens, this is Master Chief Martinez. The technique she's describing uses principles that aren't taught in standard flight training, but the physics are sound. Your aircraft's damaged tail rotor can't provide directional control, but main rotor torque can be used for attitude control if you're willing to fly inverted. Through the radio, they could hear the sounds of an aircraft and distress alarms. Shouting, the mechanical stress of systems being pushed beyond their design limits. 8 people were experiencing the terror of uncontrolled flight, their survival dependent on trusting guidance from someone they'd never met, who was asking them to violate every instinct they possessed. Emergency advisor, Stephen's voice carried the desperation of someone running out of options and time. If I follow your instructions and this doesn't work, everyone aboard dies. I need to know, have you actually performed this maneuver before? Greta closed her eyes, seeing the faces of the 12 soldiers she'd saved during that night mission in Bosnia, when conventional procedures would have killed everyone aboard her aircraft. The technique had worked once under combat conditions, but each situation was different. Each aircraft carried unique variables that could make the difference between salvation and catastrophe. Captain Stevens, I've used this technique to save lives when conventional procedures failed. I won't lie to you, it's dangerous, and it requires precise timing and absolute trust in instructions that seem wrong. But your aircraft is falling towards certain death if you continue trying standard recovery procedures. This gives you a chance. The command area held its collective breath as Stevens processed the choice between certain death and a technique that offered survival at the cost of violating everything he'd been taught about emergency procedures. NATO observers watched their demonstration turn into a real-time test of whether expertise could overcome institutional training when lives hung in the balance. All right, emergency advisor. Stephen's voice carried the flat acceptance of someone who'd run out of conventional options. I'm reducing collective and applying left cyclic. God help us all if you're wrong about this. Greta felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with controlling other people's lives through radio communications. 8 people were about to trust their survival to techniques she'd developed through desperation and refined through experience that existed in no official training program. Sometimes the most important alliances were formed between people who'd never met, connected only by radio waves and the shared understanding that survival required abandoning safety for the chance of living. Nighthawk 27, altitude now 400 feet, Stevens reported, his voice tight with concentration as he fought every instinct screaming at him to reject the guidance he was receiving. Collective is at minimum, left cyclic applied. Aircraft is entering inverted attitude. This feels completely wrong. We're falling faster now. Greta watched the technical displays that Martinez had configured to show real-time telemetry from the failing aircraft. The data painted a terrifying picture: descent rate increasing, aircraft attitude becoming increasingly inverted, all conventional recovery options eliminated. They were now committed to a maneuver that would either save 8 lives or ensure that everyone aboard died in the most spectacular way possible. "Captain Stevens, that's exactly what should be happening," Greta said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd guided aircraft through impossible situations before. "Your aircraft is now flying inverted, but you're gaining control. Authority that doesn't exist in conventional flight attitudes. I need you to gradually increase collective pitch while maintaining left cyclic. The main rotor torque will begin providing directional control as you add power." Master Chief Martinez monitored backup system status on her tablet, calling out readings that confirmed Greta's technique was working according to principles that existed outside standard training. "Emergency advisor. Hydraulic pressure is stabilizing. Main rotor torque is increasing as collective comes up. The aircraft is responding to control inputs differently than normal, but it is responding." Through the command area's windows they could see search and rescue helicopters launching from Ramstein's flight line, their crews preparing for a recovery mission that might find wreckage instead of survivors. The NATO observers watched their military demonstration become a real-time test of whether unconventional expertise could overcome institutional limitations when death was the alternative to innovation. "Altitude 250 feet, Stevens reported, his voice carrying the first hint of hope they'd heard since the emergency began. "Aircraft attitude is inverted, but stable. I'm beginning to understand what you meant about main rotor torque providing directional control. This is like flying a completely different aircraft." General Morrison stood beside Greta, his experienced eye tracking the tactical displays that showed an aircraft doing things that weren't supposed to be possible. 30 years of military aviation had taught him to recognize when conventional wisdom became an obstacle to mission success, and what he was witnessing transcended every training program he'd ever encountered. "Emergency advisor." Stevens' voice carried growing confidence as he mastered techniques that existed in no official curriculum. "I'm beginning to see how this works. The aircraft wants to fly inverted. It's more stable in this attitude than it was before the tail rotor failed. But how do I land an inverted helicopter without killing everyone aboard?" Greta opened her combat diary to page 351, where detailed sketches showed the landing phase of the technique she'd used to save 12 soldiers in Bosnia. The diagrams looked like something from a fantasy novel, an aircraft touching down upside down with rotors spinning normally, defying every principle of conventional helicopter operations. "Captain Stevens, you're going to perform what's called an inverted autorotation landing. It sounds impossible, but the physics work if you understand how to use ground effect while inverted. The key is timing your collective input to arrest descent rate just before ground contact, then using cyclic to control the aircraft's attitude as it settles." Master Chief Martinez studied the technical diagrams with the fascination of someone whose engineering mind was processing aerodynamic principles that challenged everything she'd learned about helicopter flight. "Emergency advisor, this technique isn't in any maintenance manual I've seen. Where did you learn to fly aircraft in configurations that shouldn't be survivable?" "Chief, I learned it from people who died when conventional techniques failed," Greta replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience earned through survival in situations where innovation was the only alternative to death. "Every technique I'm using was developed because standard procedures would have killed aircrew. Sometimes the most important knowledge comes from missions that never made it into official reports." "Altitude 100 feet, Stevens reported, his voice now carrying the focused concentration of someone who'd accepted that survival required mastering impossible skills under pressure. Aircraft is stable inverted. I can see the landing zone ahead, a small clearing in mountainous terrain. Beginning approach for inverted auto-rotation landing. The command area fell silent except for radio communications from an aircraft attempting a maneuver that existed in no training syllabus. NATO observers gathered around displays showing telemetry data that documented the first successful inverted helicopter recovery in recorded military history, while search and rescue crews prepared for outcomes that ranged from miraculous survival to complete catastrophe. "Captain Stevens," Greta said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd successfully completed this maneuver before. "At 50 feet altitude, I need you to begin increasing collective pitch while applying. Right cyclic to control your landing attitude. The aircraft will want to flip right side up during the landing flare. Let it happen, but control the rotation rate with gentle inputs." "Emergency advisor, I'm trusting you with 8 lives," Stevens replied, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that came with commanding aircrew whose survival depended on techniques that transcended conventional training. "Beginning landing flare now. Altitude 50 feet. Collective coming up. Aircraft is responding exactly as you predicted." Sometimes the most important moments in military history were witnessed by people who understood that they were watching. Something that would never be officially acknowledged, but would be quietly studied for years afterward. "Collective is up. Aircraft is flaring," Stevens reported, his voice steady with the focused concentration of someone who'd learned to trust techniques that transcended conventional wisdom. "Altitude 20 feet. The aircraft wants to rotate right side. Up exactly as you predicted. I'm controlling the rotation rate with cyclic inputs. This is actually working." Greta felt the familiar surge of vindication that came with proving that experience earned through survival could overcome institutional training when lives hung in the balance. Through the radio, she could hear the mechanical sounds of an aircraft doing something that shouldn't be possible. Rotors spinning normally while the fuselage completed a controlled rotation from inverted to upright attitude during the final moments before ground contact. "Touchdown." Stevens' voice exploded through the radio with the joy of someone who just cheated death through techniques that existed in no official manual. "All crew members safe. Aircraft is upright and stable on the ground. Emergency advisor, I don't know who you are, but you just saved 8 lives using flying techniques I didn't know existed." The command area erupted in spontaneous applause from NATO observers who just witnessed military aviation history being written in real time. General Morrison removed his cap in a gesture of respect that acknowledged expertise wherever it originated, while Master Chief Martinez stared at telemetry data that documented the first successful inverted helicopter recovery in recorded military history. Colonel Harrison approached Greta with the subdued expression of someone whose rigid adherence to protocol had nearly resulted in a catastrophe that would have damaged NATO relationships for decades. His career-focused decision-making had been revealed as inadequate for situations that required innovation over institutional compliance. "Ma'am," Harrison said, his voice carrying the humility of someone who'd learned that expertise often came from unexpected sources, "I owe you an apology. Your analysis was correct, and my refusal to consider input from outside official channels nearly resulted in the loss of 8 aircrew members and an international incident that could have reshaped alliance relationships." But Greta's attention was focused on the radio communications from the rescue site, where Captain Stevens was providing details that would revolutionize emergency helicopter procedures. Mission control. The inverted recovery technique worked exactly as described. Aircraft systems remained functional throughout the maneuver. All crew members are uninjured. We need to debrief this procedure immediately. It could save lives in future emergency situations. General Morrison stepped forward with the purposeful stride of someone whose tactical brilliance had been earned through recognizing talent, regardless of its packaging. He'd built his reputation on making decisions that prioritized mission success over institutional comfort, and what he'd just witnessed represented expertise that demanded official recognition. "Ms. Kozlov," Morrison said, using her name for the first time since she'd been dismissed as a homeless woman making outrageous claims. "I'm offering you a position as senior helicopter flight instructor with NATO's Advanced Tactics Division. Your techniques need to be documented, taught, and integrated into emergency procedures that could save aircrew throughout the alliance." The offer hung in the air like rotor wash, transforming a woman who'd been invisible to the military system into someone whose expertise was desperately needed by the same institutions that had discarded her. The NATO observers were already discussing how the inverted recovery technique could be adapted for their own helicopter programs, while Master Chief Martinez was taking notes that would influence maintenance protocols across multiple air forces. Through the fence she'd sat beside for 6 months, Greta could see the flight line where search and rescue helicopters were returning to base, their crews no longer needed for a recovery mission that had become a rescue success story. The Black Hawk she'd predicted would fail catastrophically had instead become the platform for demonstrating techniques that would be studied and refined for years afterward. "Captain," Stephen's voice crackled through the radio with a request that completed her transformation from invisible to essential. "Mission Control. I want to speak directly to the emergency advisor who guided us through that recovery. What she did today represents flying skills that need to be preserved and taught to every helicopter pilot in NATO." Greta keyed the radio with hands that no longer trembled, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise had been validated through the most demanding test possible, keeping people alive when conventional wisdom failed. "Captain Stevens, this is Greta Kozlov, former Croatian Air Force major and current NATO flight instructor. When you return to base, we'll begin documenting these techniques for integration into advanced emergency procedures." The spontaneous salute began. With General Morrison, whose 3 decades of military service had taught him to recognize exceptional performance regardless of its source. Master Chief Martinez followed, then Colonel Harrison, then the NATO observers whose diplomatic training included understanding when they were witnessing something historically significant. One by one, every military officer in the command area came to attention and rendered the salute reserved for recognizing extraordinary service to the alliance. The homeless woman who'd been dismissed as delusional 12 hours earlier was now receiving the respect accorded to someone whose expertise had prevented an international catastrophe, while advancing military aviation in ways that would benefit aircrew for generations. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ramstein Air Base, Greta realized that her journey from decorated pilot to homeless veteran to recognized expert had come full circle in ways she'd never imagined possible. The system that had destroyed her career through bureaucratic betrayal was now offering her a position that would allow her to share knowledge that could save lives throughout NATO's helicopter forces. Her combat diary, filled with techniques developed through survival necessity, would become the foundation for advanced training programs that challenged conventional wisdom with proven alternatives. The upside-down landing that had saved 12 soldiers in Bosnia would now be taught to pilots whose lives might depend on understanding that aircraft could be controlled in ways that transcended standard procedures. 6 months ago, she'd arrived at Ramstein with nothing but discharge papers and an unshakable need to be near military aircraft. Tonight, she would sleep in base quarters as a senior instructor whose expertise was considered essential for NATO's operational readiness. Sometimes, redemption arrived through demonstrating that the most important knowledge came from people who'd learned to fly in places where textbook solutions could prove fatal. Sometimes the most valuable person in any operation was the one everyone had learned to ignore. The Black Hawk that had carried 8 people through an impossible recovery sat on the landing zone as maintenance crews began the investigation that would confirm sabotage while documenting techniques that had turned potential catastrophe into revolutionary advancement, Greta Kozlov was no longer invisible. She was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.